Thanks very much for joining us today, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So first, I'd like to introduce our guests. We're really happy to have a great program today and some really interesting and good speakers. We have Jill Davis, Associate Chief Accountant from the Division of Corporation Finance in the Office of the Chief Accountant at the Securities and Exchange Commission. We also have Kimberly Earle, Associate Chief Accountant, Division of Economic and Risk Analysis in the Office of Structured Disclosure at the SEC. And we also have Walter Hampshire, Senior IT Program Manager, Office of Structured Disclosure at the Securities and Exchange Commission. Campbell Pride, President and CEO of XBRL US. And we have Andy Wood, Senior Technical Manager of IFRS at the International Accounting Standards Board. In our program today, here's a brief listing of our agenda. We're going to start off with some discussion about the SEC notice and what it means for issuers. We're going to have some CPE questions, so for those of you who have asked to obtain CPE, please make sure that you respond to the CPE questions. We're then going to have a demonstration of the IFRS Taxonomy. We'll continue with some discussion, go on to CPE questions, and then finally we have a brief set of poll questions for you, for our audience, because we're very interested in what you think about the IFRS notice and what it means for you. So just a few logistical points before we get started. Some of you have already found the Q&A, which is great. There is a Q&A link at the top of the screen, so if you have questions, please click on that link, key in your question, and we'll take it through the program. Secondly, if you have any issues with any technical issues accessing the event, please send us an email at support, SUPPORT, @xbrl.us, and we'll do our best to get you back up and online. So with that, I want to thank everybody very much for coming. We've got a jam-packed schedule and a lot to cover today. I also want to mention that we are planning on having a follow-up webinar to this program, also covering the IFRS taxonomy in May. So if your questions don't get responded to today, rest assured that we will cover them in our next webinar. But so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Campbell Pride, who's going to moderate our session.
Thank you, Michelle. And so if we could just bring up the questions and share your screen with those, and then we can start going through them, that'd be great. So we've got some folks from the SEC on the call today, and I just wanted to, just so everyone understands what their roles and responsibilities are, if I could just ask Jill and Kimberly, what are the roles of the Office of Corporation Finance and the Office of Structured Disclosure at the SEC?
Hi, Campbell. This is Jill. I'll go ahead and get started and talk a bit about the Division of Corporation Finance. Our division regulates companies that are required to report with the Securities and Exchange Commission under both the 33 and 34 Acts. And the way that we regulate our issuers is that we perform periodic reviews by our staff. We have a staff of both accountants, attorneys, and even oil and gas and mining engineers. And then we organize the workflow, our work streams by industry group. And so our staff will regularly review issuer filings. And I think it's also important to highlight, since we're talking to a large population of foreign private issuers, that each issuer that is required to file with us will receive the same level, same type of review as any other issuer. So if you're a foreign private issuer, you apply IFRS, you're going to actually be receiving the exact same level and scrutiny as if you were, as a US GAAP filer that happens to be a domestic issuer. Obviously, there's some differences based on the rules. A foreign private issuer have a distinct set of rules, but I would very easily say that all of our staff are equally fluent in US GAAP as well as IFRS.
Thanks, Jill. Kimberly, could you give us an overview of the Office of Structured Disclosure?
Hi, Campbell. Thank you. The Office of Structured Disclosure collaborates with other SEC divisions and offices on data structuring approaches for required disclosures. We support the SEC's data collection and data usage by designing taxonomies, validation rules, data quality assessments, and tools for data analysis. We work closely with a variety of market participants, including regulated entities, data users, and others to support the submission and use of structured data. We're very excited to add XBRL for foreign private issuers into our work. It's been a long anticipated initiative, and publishing the 2016 IFRS Financial Reporting Standards Taxonomy on the Commission's website was a culmination of many years of work, and we're looking forward to receiving this data and working more closely with it and with the filers.
Okay, great. So maybe you could give us some background behind the use of XBRL for foreign private issuers.
Sure. Well, the SEC recently issued a notice specifying the IFRS taxonomy for use in SEC filings. This notice was contemplated in the 2009 rule, which required certain foreign private issuers be subject to the interactive data reporting requirements once the Commission specified the taxonomy on its website. So this notice is actually that specifies the timing that FPIs will now submit filing to the Commission, but the original rule specified the requirements as well as the specific filings, forms, and data that's required to be tagged.
Okay, great. And so what is the FPI requirement? When do they go? What is the deadline that they have to file by?
Okay, well, they can start filing now. There's no prohibition on filing now that the taxonomy has been specified on the Commission's website. So we would welcome any submissions that people would be ready to send to us. However, the notice specifies that after December 15, 2017, that the submission will become mandatory.
Okay, great. Another question we had then is, what is the notice of availability and what are the implications for FPIs?
Well, the notice, as I just said, was actually the Commission's formal specification of the IFRS taxonomy to enable filers to comply with the original 2009 rule. I would encourage anyone interested to read it because it provides additional information about requirements and other information that they may want to know.
Okay, thank you. So what is the, what work has been done on the IFRS taxonomy since the initial US GAAP rule went through? And maybe this is a good question for Andy Wood.
Hi, Campbell. Yeah, that sounds like a question for me. It's been quite a while actually since the US GAAP went rule, so a pretty large amount of work has been done on the IFRS taxonomy since then. For example, it updates for every new standard that the board sets or releases, as well as amendments to existing standards in much the same way that the FASB update their taxonomy. However, there are a couple of updates that I think are probably most relevant to FPIs and filers in the US, and those are the addition of documentation labels to the taxonomy. Initially, when the US GAAP rule went through, the IFRS taxonomy didn't have an equivalent to what are called the definitions or the documentation labels. But over the last few years, those have been added, and those are now present for elements in the taxonomy. The other, probably most relevant piece of work has been what we call our Common Practice project. That project has been to analyze financial statements and look at the use of the IFRS standards in practice to supplement the information that we already had in the taxonomy based on the standards. Those practice projects have been going on since about 2011, and they've been running through working on analysis by industry activity. Those practices will be continuing, and we're very interested to hear suggestions from anyone as to areas that they think need covering, or as tagging takes place or test tagging takes place, we'd also be interested to hear if there are suggestions for industries that we should be looking at next. The latest common practice projects are looking more at working with our post-implementation reviews so that we also catch common practice that appears as a standard goes into use in the market.
Okay, great. So maybe this might be quite good. We've got a demonstration set up to basically give everyone on the call just a quick demo of the IFRS taxonomy, just so they can see it and they know where they can access it from and how it works.
Okay, I shall just, okay, so hopefully you should now all be able to see this. This is actually a thing called EIFRS. It's an electronic version of the standards, and as part of this service, you can see here on the left-hand side, we have a link for the IFRS taxonomy. This is one way of viewing the taxonomy that's on our website. And we have available the hierarchy of the taxonomy here. This is available as a free service. It requires registration, however, you can see I'm logged in up here. Now, the IFRS taxonomies, despite a couple of reasonably well-known differences, in many ways it's actually quite similar to the US GAAP taxonomy. Obviously, the US GAAP taxonomy is larger. The IFRS taxonomy has just over 5,800 elements. However, it's worth bearing in mind that just over 1,000 of those are actually for SME reporting, and so wouldn't be relevant to US filers. The taxonomy itself, as you can see, is arranged using numbered codes to order the presentation groups in the same way as the US GAAP taxonomy. We make use of dimensions modeling in a very similar way. We often talk to the FASB about how the different standards are going to be modeled, especially where the FASB and the ISB have been working on a converged standard. And we have a set of initial presentation groups that are the primary financial statements, as well as some little general information about the financial statements. We have a set of groups that are the notes, including here you can see we've got a list of notes and a list of accounting policies. And then if you scroll down to the bottom, you can see there's also a set of general axes these are axes that will often be used in a more general fashion throughout the financial statements. So for example, consolidated and separate financial statements, continuing and discontinuing operations and that kind of thing. If we were going to look at other differences, I'd say one thing that we do is the IFRS taxonomy makes more use of text elements to cover narrative. And it also doesn't make use of TINs, which is the taxonomy implementation notes that the FASB taxonomy has. One thing it's worth bearing in mind, however, if you identify something that seems to be sort of a big difference between the two taxonomies, is that it's quite possibly related to an underlying difference in the standards themselves, not necessarily a difference in choice by the taxonomy teams. So for example, one thing we often hear is that the IFRS taxonomy doesn't seem to have a large number of industry-related items available. However, partly that's related to the underlying standards themselves. The IFRSs in general are more neutral as to the application by different industry activities, but also just that industry practice that we have added with common practice is distributed throughout the taxonomy. So for example, if we look at, oh, I've lost my note. I had a feeling I was going to do that if I moved everything. So if we look through here, you can see, if we look through one of the notes, you'll start to see, for example, here we go. We have notes on revenue. We can see we have text blocks available for accounting policies and for tables as well. We also have documentation labels. So if I open up something that's a little less text-based, you can see here that we have all these, the items are arranged. We have text blocks for abstract items around tables. We use axes and members in the same way, although we don't identify the top domain for tables in quite the same way as the taxonomy. But if you look through this hierarchy, you can see that in many ways the navigation is quite similar. You can see here are the documentation labels. We've provided references between documentation labels, so it's possible, for example, in this case, to go back and see the original label for government grants. And the other particularly important item to note about the IFRS taxonomy is that it is the references. We would very much encourage users who are navigating this taxonomy for the first time, especially if they are accountants who are familiar with IFRS, to work back from the references to the taxonomy items. The presentation structure that we provide with the taxonomy is very much a navigation aid for the taxonomy. It's not intended to provide a template for financial reporting, and it doesn't restrict the nature of the items in the taxonomy. So for example, the fact that an item might be found within the taxonomy as something that is seen in the note for leases, this would not restrict that item also being used for tagging something that was available on a primary financial statement if it was appropriate for that item to be on the statement in the report. So that we very much don't see the presentation link base as restricting the definition of the items. The most important way to judge the meaning of an item is to look carefully at the label, the documentation label, which gives more detail, and to examine the references that have been provided and check and work back from the standards to find the most appropriate items. We also have a number of common axes throughout here for which can be used in a number of different circumstances. Again, their location in the taxonomy does not restrict them being used in different tables if appropriate. So for example, this would be things like the axes I first showed at the beginning at the bottom, these general axes here, but there are also axes for such concepts as maturity and ranges, and it's worth bearing those in mind if you're looking at tagging a table somewhere in the taxonomy where you could also use, we have, for example, here aggregated time bands and maturity axis. I think the only other major point to mention in a tour is that we have a slightly smaller number of data types in use. This taxonomy doesn't tend to make as much use of custom data types as the US GAAP taxonomy. And the references here, as you can see, all of these are provided as links, which will go through to the standard, depending on the level of access you have. If you have a basic account, then it will take you through to the PDF version of the standard. If you already have an IFRS professional subscription, which some preparers may well do, then this will take the links will take you straight through to a HTML version of the standard with embedded taxonomy information. Again, this is a very handy way to navigate back from the standard that you're already implementing with your financial report to the relevant taxonomy items. I think the only other difference that I would like to highlight is that the IFRS taxonomy is developed on a slightly different timeline. As I mentioned earlier, it is updated for new standards and amendments to standards, but as well as common practice projects. However, each of these changes is put out for a public comment period during the year. And so if it is relevant for, if feedback needs to be given on a standard, we would encourage people to keep track of those updates during the year and to give us feedback at that point. When we put the taxonomy into the annual taxonomy, this is a compilation only. There is no further public consultation at that stage. Obviously, if you have more general feedback, as I mentioned about common practice, for example, then we welcome feedback during the year on those topics. Obviously, we may not be in a position to immediately make changes if we do not have a release coming up. Just to answer a question, I can see I'm scrolling by on the question screen. Yes, documentation labels are in general the same as the definitions in US GAAP. We will occasionally also call them definitions.
Okay, thank you, Andy. And just to reiterate, this is everything Andy showed you here is available on the IFRS website, so you can go and have a look at this and start to explore the taxonomy to your heart's content. So I will, moving on, thank you, Andy, for that demonstration. We'd go back to the questions, please, Michelle. And I guess a question here for Walter Hampshire from the SEC, and is, what are some of the things that FPI filers should be aware of, some of the challenges that they might face in terms of filing? Walter, you might be on mute.
I was on mute. Let me just say that the SEC, as a matter of policy, disclaims responsibility for any private publication or statement by any of its employees. The views expressed herein are those of the author and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Commission or the author's colleagues upon the staff of the Commission. A lot depends on how automated your existing process for filing your existing 20F to the SEC is. If it's a very manual process, then one of the things we observed early on, this is not really such an issue anymore, but it was the sort of thing where you kind of had to finish your financial statements a little bit early, like a day or two, and in other words, you kind of had to have pencils down on the formal sort of HTML attachment of your financials before you could really complete the tagging. Now, once again, that was a phenomenon which we saw with companies as they were first filing XBRL for the very first couple of times. Over time, that seems to have gone away with improvements in tools and better processes and so on. And of course, some of our well, let me just leave it at that. We basically can't talk about inline on this call, so I was about to say inline, but I can't say that. I guess what I would say is that seemed to always be a major issue. I think there's often concerns about, how many, it's so much smaller, so many fewer elements. Well, we're going to need so many extensions. Actually, I just want to say that over the years, the reason it's taken a long time, I think, to get to this point is because I would say that, once again, speaking for myself, I've convinced myself that the IFRS taxonomy has enough common practice elements in it that you're just not going to see anything particularly different go on with extensions in the IFRS taxonomy as you do already in US GAAP. Indeed, just to elaborate on that point further, our goal in the EFM, the Edgar Filer Manual, is if we don't have to mention US GAAP or IFRS at all, and the same rules of syntax and consistency and so on apply to both, that's the ideal that we're actually shooting for. And so consequently, in almost every respect, anything that can be said about how you file a US GAAP taxonomy filing is going to apply equally to an IFRS filing. And if you stop and think about it, well, how could it actually be otherwise, right? It kind of has to be that way. Okay, long answer, short question. Sorry.
Good answer, though. And I think you answered one of many of the questions that we've had today is, will people be able to file extensions using the IFRS taxonomy? And I think the answer to that was yes, based on that. So will using XBRL data produced in IFRS be the same as US GAAP? And there's a couple of answers to this one, but in addition, just a tack-on question people have asked, will they be able to use US GAAP elements in their filing?
Is this one still for me, Campbell? I think that you have to be very careful. I think I don't think any accountant who knows that IFRS and US GAAP are different, their immediate reaction would be, of course not. They mean totally different things because they're based on entirely different, accounting standards. There are areas of convergence, no question about it. There are some cases where the elements will mean the same thing, but in general, you should assume no. There's one special case which I believe Kim will be speaking to a little bit later, but in general, no. Don't regard the US GAAP taxonomy as just a big bag of jelly beans that you can pick and choose the ones to fit into your IFRS statement. That's not the intent.
Great. And Andy, do you have anything to add on this?
I not particularly, no. The IFRS taxonomy is intended for use with IFRS filing, and I believe the US GAAP taxonomy is intended for use with the FASB standards. A few of those standards are converged, but in general, I wouldn't encourage chopping and changing between the two taxonomies.
Okay, great. And then just from the perspective of someone consuming the data, and I know that from our side we've been working on this too, in terms of using the data. So we when people start filing, we will be taking that data into our databases and making it available to people, as I'm sure many of the data aggregators will. And I think the thing to remember on this is that even though the elements may be the same, things like assets, they've got the same name in both IFRS and in US GAAP, they are different elements, they have different definitions, they can be calculated in different ways. So if you are using this data the one thing to be aware of is if you're pulling some of these values, just to make sure you're fully aware of where that term is coming from. But a number of the data aggregators I've talked to are working on integrating IFRS filings into their offerings as well. So I think, as compared to the filings that were done under the US GAAP program originally, a lot of this data should become readily available far more quickly than it was for US GAAP reported data. So I think that brings us to some CPE questions, Michelle. So is it possible to bring those up on the screen?
Yes, just give me a minute here, and I have to get out of this and go to the admin screen. Okay.
Just while Michelle is bringing that up, in terms of Kim, I just ask you some of these questions, just some of the questions in terms of timing requirements for the rule, and maybe you could get into a little bit more detail on what some of those are.
Oh, sure, Campbell. The timing is really guided by the notice that came out on March 1st. There's an initial period where submitting filings using the IFRS taxonomy is voluntary, but it can happen anytime now after that notice. But for financial periods ending after December 15th, 2017, it's going to be mandatory. So very simple timeline there.
Okay, great. And there is no, I know we had a few questions, there's no phase-in period like there was under the original program, correct? Correct.
And we're going to be putting out some FAQs. We hope to put those out the next, in the future, near future, as soon as we can. But the original provisions in the 2009 rule for the phase-in of tagging and the phase-in by filer size, etc., those no longer exist. As well as the limited liability provisions, which expired in October 14th, those are not extended. Those no longer exist. There is a grace period, however, that still exists of 30 days for the first filing of the XBRL data.
Okay, great. Just while Michelle's working on this, I'll give you a couple more questions. So what should be tagged?
I think Jill was going to weigh in a little bit on that one.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Kim and Campbell. Interestingly enough, I think sometimes we've had a little bit of confusion, or perhaps there's been some idea that the fact that now that companies that apply IFRS and file with us will have to have their data tagged to the ISB taxonomy. There's been some concern that perhaps that event itself would somehow change the application of IFRS, or perhaps change the disclosures within the financial statements. But we don't view this as any impact on how a company would interpret or apply IFRS to their particular transactions, or change any of the actual disclosure in the filing.
Okay, great. Okay. Do you have anything to add to that, Kimberly?
Yes, I would just point filers to the original 2009 rule, because that scopes out exactly what needs to be tagged and the specific forms and requirements for tagging.
Okay, great. Thank you. So just moving on with that, what are the rules regarding phase-in, and particularly the liability and detailed tagging?
Well, the liability provision expired in October 2014, and that so that no longer exists. As far as the phase-in, there's no phase-in immediately. The detailed tagging requirements exist, and there's no phase-in for issuer filer size or status. So all FPIs are subject to the requirement after December 2017.
Okay, great. And
Oh, I'm sorry. I was actually going to highlight as well that, you know, we do have guidance on our website regarding, using interactive data. A lot of it was developed as, you know, filers were filing with the US GAAP taxonomy, but we thought it would be helpful to highlight that that guidance is on our website, and it's in the form of what we call a compliance and disclosure interpretation. So if you go to our website and you look to the Corporation Finance website under the compliance and disclosures, it would be within the section called interactive data. There's a whole host of questions and answers that we think are very relevant to foreign private issuers, and we think that could also be quite helpful. So we encourage companies to look to that.
And that's on the SEC website, right?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. I think you covered the grace period, Kimberly, and we did a couple of questions from folks asking, does the actual filing and XBRL filing have to be done at the same time? So maybe you should just clarify that for some of the folks on the line.
Yes, the XBRL is submitted at the same time as the primary filing.
Okay.
But for the initial filing, as I stated, there is a 30-day grace period.
Is that in the rule? I mean, is that actually, I'm sorry, that's the first I've heard of that. I actually didn't know that. This is Walter.
Yes, that was in the original 2009 rule, and it still stands.
Okay.
Yeah, so you get the one grace period for your first filing.
Correct.
Right.
And to add on to what Jill was saying, there's a number of resources on the Office of Structured Disclosure website, xbrl.sec.gov. So I would encourage interested parties to take a look at that. There's a lot of resources and information and links to other places on the SEC site where they can become better informed about the requirements for XBRL at the SEC, since this is very new to them. One place to become familiar with as well is the SEC Taxonomies page. One question that this audience might have is about the 2017 IFRS Taxonomy that was recently published. Currently, the SEC has specified the 2016 taxonomy, but they should monitor the Taxonomies page and new EDGAR releases so that they can stay informed about taxonomy updates. I would highly encourage them also as well to sign up for updates from the Office of Structured Disclosure. We periodically send email or update an RSS feed of news. And Michelle has the link to sign up for that on a later slide.
Thank you. Yeah, and we've had a lot of questions about when that taxonomy will be put up. So I think you got your answer there for that. You'd asked that question. So just the next question, we've had a number of questions from people leading up to this webinar. So maybe I can go through some of those questions that have come in. And I think probably, Walter, this first one is probably best for you. Is there any guidance related to the use of dimensions on the face financial statements? Walter, you might be on mute.
Not really an IFRS question, but yes, there's an FAQ number B14 on the SEC website that describes the answer to that question.
Thank you. And another question, and you kind of touched on this a bit earlier, are there any different EFM rules for IFRS versus US GAAP?
Yeah, our goal is to have no differences at all. And people should assume that we are going to achieve that.
Okay, great.
I mean, and one of the reasons is because as early as 2012, we collaborated with the IFRS Foundation on something called the Global Filing Manual. While the Global Filing Manual does not govern EDGAR filings, there's a lot in there that if you were to look at that, or you've seen it before, you would immediately recognize is essentially identical to the EDGAR Filer Manual. But I have to emphasize, it's the EDGAR Filer Manual that governs EDGAR filings.
Yep. The next question someone had was, which taxonomies make foreign private issuers use in SEC filings? And Kimberly, this might be a question for you, and I think we've kind of touched on this quite a bit already. So if you have any, if there's anything you think you want to add other than what's on the approved taxonomy listings.
I would just say that there actually is a requirement in the Edgar Filer manual that the taxonomy be specified on the SEC website. So it's actually an official product that is put out in an Edgar release. So that's where people can go for guidance on the taxonomies page, and that is really the official notification and list of which taxonomy may be used or which may not be used if it's not listed.
Okay, great. So this is just a question. I know there's a public comment in for inline, but you may be able to answer this. May IFRS filers voluntarily file in an inline XBRL format if they choose to file? You mentioned earlier that they could file now if they wanted to. Could they do that in inline XBRL?
Yeah, we can't answer that.
You cannot?
Nope.
Okay.
Pretend I never said the word.
Campbell, it's Michelle Savage here again. I apologize. We've had a couple of technical issues with bringing polls up, but we're ready to do that now. If you want to stop and take a couple of quick poll questions.
Yes, please. If we can do that, that'd be great.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we're going to ask a couple of CPE questions here, and the first CPE question we have is: the SEC notice on the IFRS taxonomy indicates that foreign private issuers must submit their first filing no later than, and we have three options here: immediately, for their first annual report on Form 20F or 40F for a fiscal period ending on or after December 15th, 2017, or third response, for their first annual report on Form 20F or 40F for a fiscal period ending on or after December 15th, 2018. Okay, so again, if you're getting CPE credit, please be sure to respond to this question so that we can make sure we get your certificate to you. We'll just give it a minute here. If you're not getting CPE credit, there's no need to respond, but if you are, please do. Looks like we still have people coming in, so we'll give it a couple minutes, give it a couple seconds rather. Okay, I'm just going to give it about 10 more seconds. And then we'll go on to our next poll question. Okay, I'm going to end the poll right now. All right, and we're going to launch our second poll question for CPE credit. In 2009, when issuers using US GAAP became required to submit XBRL filings along with their HTML filing, foreign private issuers that file in IFRS were exempt from this requirement because, answer one, the SEC gave a longer phase-in period for foreign private issuers. Answer two, the IFRS taxonomy was not yet ready. Or three, foreign private issuers were required to file using the US GAAP taxonomy. Okay, so just to, again, respond to this, and we'll give it a few, about 30 more seconds, and then we'll go back to our questions here. And we will have two more CPE questions later on in the program, and we're also going to have some audience polling questions, as I mentioned earlier.
Okay.
I'm going to end the polling here. I'll turn it back to Campbell.
Thank you, Michelle. We had one other question come in on the grace period. There's a little bit of confusion, and maybe Kimberly, you could just clarify this. So the question was, clarify the 30-day grace period. Is that 30 days gives you a grace period for the combined XBRL and HTML filing, or must you file the normal filing and you got 30-day grace period for the XBRL filing?
Campbell, that applies only to the XBRL. So the requirements for filing the actual form itself remain within the form rules, but the XBRL may be submitted up to 30 days after that.
For the first filing only, right?
For the first filing only, correct.
Right. Okay, so moving along, just on the IFRS taxonomy, we have some additional questions here, and then maybe Andy could probably best answer some of these. Is the tax, and this is a specific, very specific question that came in, is the taxonomy used for reporting to the Mexican Stock Exchange the same as the IFRS taxonomy?
I believe that there is some form of filing using the IFRS taxonomy in some format on the Mexican Stock Exchange, but in general, the regulators in individual filing systems are responsible for how a taxonomy is used and what format it's in. We may have some ideas, but it's a much better idea if you need confirmation about an individual regulatory system to ask that regulator directly.
Okay, great. Another question around the IFRS taxonomy is, how will the IFRS taxonomy be updated and maintained? I know you talked about that a little bit, but will there be a public comment period similar to the FASB and US GAAP? I think you answered that question already in your previous comments, but is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Nothing in particular, just that just to remind everybody that I said that comment periods happen throughout the year and not on the annual taxonomy, and that feedback on those exposure drafts throughout the year would be very, very welcome. It is possible to sign up to follow taxonomy news on the IFRS website, and we'd encourage foreign private issuers and other interested parties to sign up to do that so they're aware of the updates and can comment if necessary.
So just an additional question on that. If there has been an update to the taxonomy that's not part of a standards update, let's say it's a change to something because of, for some reason, would that be included in one of those comment periods?
Yes, there are comment periods for common practice updates, and also if such an update was to happen, for any kind of technology update.
Okay, great, thank you. Has anyone developed training material, and where would you access that training material on the overall structure of the IFRS taxonomy?
I'm not aware of what kind of commercial materials or otherwise might be out there, and I'm afraid I wouldn't be in a position to recommend any in particular if there were. We do have some materials available as part of the support material we provide for the taxonomy on the IFRS taxonomy website. We are working at the moment on an additional guide aimed at preparers that we'll be publishing later this year.
Okay, great, thank you. And as follow up on that, I suppose, are there any sample files that show the application of the IFRS taxonomy to disclosures that can be used as a reference guide?
We produce a small number of sample files which are based on the illustrative examples that present in the published standards. However, we do not produce full filing examples, at least in part because the taxonomy is used in a number of different filing systems around the world, and it would be difficult for us to produce examples that would be applicable in all the different systems.
Okay, great. Are there any table text blocks tags in the IFRS taxonomy to accommodate level 3 tagging?
We do have some text blocks. I'm not familiar with all of the details for the requirements for level 3 tagging, but there are a number of text blocks provided with tables throughout the taxonomy, and there are text blocks also provided for other purposes, including note text blocks.
I'm pretty familiar with them. Let me just expand on that a little bit. As always, as you will see throughout the Edgar Filer Manual and all of our guidance, the most important thing is not so much exactly what the name of the element was, or even necessarily where it appeared in the original presentation structure of a taxonomy, but rather its scope and the definition of what it is meant to contain. You should assume that if you have a table whose content precisely matches something that is in the IFRS taxonomy as a text block, then that is most appropriately used as the table text block. And I think if you look at actual practice in US GAAP filings, you'll see that the distinction between what is considered a table text block versus a text block can be somewhat fluid depending on presentation choices made by the filers. So always more important to match the scope of the element to its content, much more important than worrying about the element name.
Thank you, Walter. And if you've got questions, please put your questions in, and there's an answered box on there. So I know Walter and Andy have been answering questions that you asked online. So if you've asked a question and you don't think it's been answered, it may have been answered online, so you can check that as well, because we're not going to get all through these questions verbally. So, but check that box as we're updating it as we go. Another question we had was related to calculation relationships defined in the taxonomy. Do they hold a strict meaning, such that if an element is moved from one calculation to another, would an extension be required?
I can't answer about extension requirements directly. I'm sure somebody else can do that. However, I can answer that the calculation link rates is not intended to provide a strict definition for components of an item. It should not be used as a way of defining whether or not an item should have a particular component or not when tagging. That's not the way we develop that link base.
And the same is true in the US GAAP taxonomy. However, let's be realistic here. If what you're tagging is causing you to create calculation links that are just plainly inconsistent with the original, you're probably doing something wrong. And so consequently, you might want to inspect exactly what you're doing. I think it should be obvious to all US GAAP filers by this point that we actually do pay attention to the content of those calculation links, and we detect things like that. While it's not strictly a definitional component of the taxonomy, it clearly is meaningful. Otherwise, it wouldn't be there in the taxonomy in the first place.
Thank you, Walter. That's very helpful. Given that there are, and then a question related to axes and dimensions in the US, we refer to them as axes, but can be called dimensions in other jurisdictions, just to make sure what an axis is. Given there are a few axes or dimensions in the IFRS taxonomy, do you expect more extensions of axes or dimensions for IFRS filings? So maybe, Walter, that might be a question for you.
I'm really, I guess what I would say, we don't have any formal comment on that, obviously. But I will say, as I said earlier, over the course of the years in observing and working with the folks who work on the IFRS taxonomy, I personally think they've done a splendid job of analyzing foreign private issuers, industries, and so on, with a fairly rigorous methodology for deciding when an element belongs in the common practice section of the taxonomy. So I guess I would say I'd be personally very surprised if it was higher, but that's not in any way an official policy. I just think they happen to have done a really good job with that.
Okay, thank you, Walter. So we'll jump to the next slide, Michelle. So given the limited industry-specific and other types of elements in the IFRS taxonomy, should filers default to elements from the US GAAP taxonomy as extensions if no elements exist in the IFRS taxonomy? Is there any guidance on how to create extensions that will facilitate consumption? Maybe you guys can say. I can probably answer that one too. But Walter, if you want to have a crack.
Well, I don't know. It's something that came up kind of late in the day, because I think, quite honestly, it has always seemed so obvious to us that these are different accounting standards, and that's sort of the context of any given definition that you find on any US GAAP element or IFRS element. The one exception you might think of is that there are regulations for the SEC that are they're not part of GAAP. They're like schedules, for example, for certain kinds of industries. It's conceivable, and we haven't done that study in detail, it's conceivable that some of those do specify that they must be US GAAP, and so therefore that's one of the reasons why a US GAAP element can appear in an IFRS filing. But I think it's a little early for us to be saying any specific guidance about that. Technically, both taxonomies can appear. Elements and facts from both taxonomies can appear. The exact conditions under whether that's appropriate are always going to be derived from the existing criteria about how one chooses an element in the first place. And keeping in mind that the XBRL disclosure, the exhibit, is part of your legal requirements. It's part of the disclosure. It's an accounting disclosure. And therefore, if you're doing tagging without taking into account what is the accounting disclosure you're making, then you're off in the ditch already. So it seems implausible to me that you'd be filling in pieces of a IFRS statement using elements that are defined in an entirely different accounting standard. That just plainly seems implausible. But I think that's about, at this point, that's as far as we're willing to go.
Okay, thanks, Walter. Another question that came in is, how are IFRS XBRL filings being validated? How might FPIs use XBRL formula rules in IFRS to validate? And one of the things, there is an example XBRL formula associated, I believe, with the IFRS taxonomy. So Andy, maybe you could comment on that.
Yes, it's not at the moment a formally official part of the IFRS taxonomy. But as Campbell says, we do provide what we consider to be example XBRL formula files on our website, and they are updated annually to match each new annual taxonomy. They provide what I guess is most easily described as documentation or warning validations. So, for example, one of the types of formula lists whether or not an item would be expected to be reported with a negative or a positive value. And another type of rule gives some indication of where items might be similar to other items with dimensional qualification. There's full documentation for all the formula on the IFRS website, and some people might find them helpful just to have a look at what's going on there. Filing is
And then to Walter, there's the EFM validation rules. You can just confirm that they also apply to IFRS filings, correct?
Yes, they do.
Okay, moving on. Tagging in IFRS. So some of these questions are kind of pretty generic, and I think some of these are being asked for me, but anyone can feel free to jump in on these. How much time and effort is involved in XBRL tagging? Does anyone on the panel want to have a crack at that one? Otherwise I will. So just in terms of time and effort, this is purely dependent really on the size of your company, the complexity of your filing, what software you're using, how you're doing it. So this is a multi, I don't know if I have a function that can answer this question for you, but this is something you're going to have to look into. And now there's lots of options. There's been a lot of experience around this, so there's lots of people who will be more than happy to talk to you about this. The next question is, can we do the tagging internally, or do we need to hire external service providers to do the tagging? There's no mandate here of what you have to do. This is purely optional. There's lots of different options. You could tag this stuff totally in-house, do it yourself. You can buy software and do it in-house yourself, which a lot of US filers do today. You can buy software and get people from the software company to help you do that tagging. You can outsource it completely to a third party if you want. There's lots of different options there, and you're not restricted in any way how you choose to do that. What would be the estimated cost if the tagging is done by external service providers in the first year and in subsequent years? Once again, that's purely a function of the size of the company, what the complexity of your filing, what transactions you have, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just something that you're going to have to work out in terms of what's there. We have done surveys in the past on this for small companies. With what the cost was in the US. I think that survey is available on our website, and we can certainly send that out to the materials here. But to give you kind of a ballpark, but that will be completely obviously dependent on how you want to do it, and there's obviously a trade-off between outsourcing it to someone completely or building an infrastructure to do it, and obviously you're going to have different cost performance over time. So maybe Michelle, we can move to the next slide, and I think you had a couple more CPE questions and some poll questions for the last 5 minutes.
That's right. Thank you, Campbell. Yeah, we have some more CPE questions, so I'm going to pull those up right now. Okay, so the first CPE question, how many elements are in the IFRS taxonomy? Either over 5,600, over 15,000, or over 8,600. So again, just click on the link that you think is most appropriate to record your answer. If you're getting CPE credit. And we'll give a few more seconds here before we end the polling on this question. Okay, it looks like most people have completed responding. So I'm going to go to the last CPE question. Okay, which statement comparing the IFRS and US GAAP taxonomies is not correct? Okay, first, the IFRS taxonomy has proportionally more text elements than US GAAP. Second, the IFRS taxonomy has fewer elements than the US GAAP taxonomy. The IFRS has more industry-specific elements than the US GAAP taxonomy. So which one, again, is not correct? And then after the CPE questions, we have a few poll questions because we're interested in getting people's input about the IFRS notice, the SEC notice on IFRS. So just like another 10 seconds here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. All right, and now we're going to go to what we're calling audience poll questions, where we're really looking for your response to these questions. And the first poll for our audience is, and again, this is not for CPE credit, this is just something we're interested in getting your viewpoint. What are the challenges for foreign private issuers with the SEC notice and the IFRS taxonomy availability? And here you can select, one or more responses. Okay, vendor software update, readiness to handle the IFRS taxonomy. Do you think that vendors are ready? Second option, foreign private issuers will have a learning curve to submit structured disclosures. Third, there's a lack of familiarity with the IFRS taxonomy, for example, on tagging industry-specific disclosures. Next option, do not expect significant challenges, issuers and vendors are ready. Or at last, you really don't know. So if this is for everybody, we're really interested in your viewpoint on what might be the challenges for foreign private issuers. And I'll give this, say, another 20 seconds. And we won't be publicizing anybody's response, individual response, but we may be, just looking at the numbers in the aggregate. And just looking at these, looks like the biggest concerns that I'm seeing here in terms of the responses is lack of familiarity with the IFRS taxonomy, and then a close second, the learning curve to submit structured disclosures. So it seems like there's less concern, a little bit less concern on vendor readiness, some concerns more on the issuer side. Okay, great. I'm going to end that polling. Thank you for giving us your input. Okay, the second audience poll is, are foreign private issuers ready to begin filing XBRL? Yes, no, or you really don't know? I think last time we had close to 200 people responded, so maybe we can get a few more. This is a kind of an easy one to respond to. Okay, and so far it's looking like about 49% say no, they're not quite ready. 17% say yes, and 34% really don't know. Okay, so let's end that polling and go to the last audience question. Are you considering, and this is for issuers, so if you're an issuer, please try to respond to this. Are you considering filing an XBRL using the IFRS taxonomy before the mandatory deadline? So just interested in your thoughts on this. Yes, no, don't know. And it looks like we do have some people that are going to. So we have 11% of our respondents so far say that they're ready to file before the mandatory deadline. That's great. Okay, so we're going to close out this poll. And that's the end of our polls. And we'll send the responses to these polls out to everybody. And let's go back to our questions. Okay, Campbell, I'll turn it back over to you.
I'm sorry, Michelle. I see so many questions here about 6Ks, which are the quarterly filings. Was that covered? Did Jill or Kim cover that?
I don't believe that we did. Should we?
Yeah,
we could certainly go through these questions.
Half the remaining questions are whether this covers 6Ks or not.
I think we should answer that. We had so many questions on that rather than manually going through and them answering them. So I don't know, you've seen some of these questions, Jill or Kimberly, and
I've been looking at the questions, Campbell. A lot of the questions are related to what is the requirement, and many of them are covered in the original 2009 rule. So that rule is relatively short by SEC standards. It's 200 pages. I would encourage everybody to go through it, and I think a lot of the answers to these questions are in there.
So maybe just a simple question people ask is, should the 6K filings be in XBRL as well?
I think in certain circumstances the 6K is, but I do not think in normal circumstances the 6K is. It's
actually a complicated question. That's why she referred to it, because it does have more to do with the content rather than the actual form. I for example, have seen annual reports filed as 6Ks. I don't know why that is, because I'm not an accountant, but I think that's the subtlety that is why we can't just give a yes or no answer.
Yeah.
Well, actually, this is Jill. You're actually right, Walter, and this was one of the questions that we had addressed in our compliance in disclosure interpretations. So if there's a scenario where a company's filing something on 6K, but it's going to be filed with well, actually, they're going to furnish it on 6K, but they're essentially going to incorporate it into a filed document to meet their reporting requirements, then that information should be tagged. And you would actually identify that. And this one, it's actually it's the question number 101.04 under our interactive data CD&Is on our website.
Okay, great. So with the questions that have been asked, we're going to keep a log of these, so we're going to roll these over into the next webinar that we have for the next event. So we've come to the top of the hour, a little bit over, so I'd like to thank all the speakers for speaking today. Thanks to Jill and to Walter and to Kimberly for taking the time. This has been very informative. And if you have any of these questions, let us know. If you have any other additional questions, please send them into Michelle, and then we will prime those up for the next webinar so we can get those answered as well. And Michelle, maybe you could just give an update on some of the upcoming events. But once again, thank you to all the speakers.
Great, thanks, Campbell. Yes, and I wanted to mention that our next event, we're actually going to have a kind of a reprise of this event, but cover a lot more questions. So even if you've attended today's event, put that on your calendar for May, because we're going to cover a lot of the same topics, and we're lucky enough to have all of the same speakers that we had today Andy Wood, who did a great job from IASB, Kimberly Earle, Walter Hampshire, Jill Davis from the SEC. So everybody is going to be back again in a month to take us through sort of phase 2 and respond to a lot of the questions that came in that we didn't have a chance to answer. And then I'm sure there'll be a lot more questions then. So that'll be May 10th. And tomorrow we'll send out the replay to this event, and also we'll send you a link to the registration page again for the IFRS event in May. We're also going to have a second event on inline XBRL in May, and we'll let you know about that too. We don't have that scheduled in yet, but we will. And we do plan on having a workshop on inline XBRL sometime this year, timing to be determined. We haven't quite finalized that yet, but you'll be hearing about that too. So that's all we wanted to cover today. I want to thank our speakers and also thank all of our registrants and attendees today. I hope it was useful for you, and hopefully we'll see you back in May. Thank you.
And Michelle and Campbell, terrific. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to talk to people. We appreciate it. Thanks.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We appreciate your participation. Thanks a lot. Okay.